Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion topic video. In this one I want to talk about comic references that we might see in upcoming Avatar Studios animated project. Especially of course the first movie, The Legend of Aang, The Last Airbender. I hesitate every time I say that title because it's kind of so clunky, but the first movie is probably the most likely place where I think we're going to see some of these obvious comic references. So straight away, what's informing this video? Why am I doing this video? Part of it is that I remembered this quote from Tim Hedrick. Now Tim Hedrick, of course, writer on ATLA and Korra, now works for Avatar Studios, and a few years ago on the Braving the Elements podcast, he actually said something about the comics in relation to Avatar Studios content. So what he said was, if you haven't read the comics and are excited for the new stuff, read the comics because it's only going to enrich your experience going forward. You are going to know more about what's up. You may recognize some characters that you haven't gotten to meet yet. So effectively, a pretty clear, almost confirmation that comic characters are probably going to be in some of this content coming up. And I think that makes sense because everything we know about the Aang movie suggests that it's going to be set somewhere in the region of probably 8 to 12 years after the furthest point into the time we're at in the comics, which is only, a few years after the end of the show itself. So yeah, absolutely. A lot of the characters who are new for the comics are absolutely on the table if we reference the right thing in the movies. So that's, I think, a hugely important thing to note. And I think it makes for a fun discussion to maybe speculate about, like we'll do in this video, which characters are probably the most likely to appear from the comics. Having read the comics, why will you have this kind of enriched experience? Know more about what's going on. Well, going to have to be some of these characters. Let's cover the other time when Avatar Studios has officially mentioned the comics in relation to the kind of new stuff coming up. Again, on a podcast, but this time the Comic-Con Metapod. Again, it probably still remains maybe the most insightful interview Mike and Brian have ever done about Avatar Studios, and it's like 3 years old. But anyway, talking about basically the canonicity of the Avatar comics going forward into kind of the new era of Avatar under Avatar Studios. Mike, first of all, comments, and there's only a minor comment from Brian. Well, what he says is that the quote's down here, but you'll note that even this website, comic book, notes that his words should encourage fans of Avatar comics, as he says that they are looking at those works as part of the established universe and trying to build upon them. This quote that I'm about to get into is probably one of the most poorly reported on quotes maybe in the entire fandom. People use this and selectively quote parts of this to push this narrative that they're going to kind of retcon all of the comics, when the takeaway, like it says here, overall is hugely positive towards the comics. So the Tim Hedrick comment combined with this absolutely give you confidence that, yeah, like they're going to use the comics. They're not just ignoring this stuff. But here's the quote. We've been involved in all those main ancillary stories, so in our mind it's mostly canon. There's probably some stuff, if we may go back, like that doesn't totally line up with this, so there may be some little tweaks here and there, but as of right now, we're proceeding as if all this stuff is part of the proper universe and hopefully building on it. They also note, and this is, I suppose, what maybe at the time was more of the main event from this part of the quote, that being that they are not doing adaptations of any of the comics or novels, at least early on. A lot of the early projects, I guess, are not going to be about this. They don't rule it out, but I don't think this is something that is at all a priority anytime soon for Avatar Studios. I think the thing we're not doing now, not saying this couldn't happen someday, is we're not adapting the graphic novels into a movie or TV show. We're not adapting the YA novels into a movie or TV show. Again, that could happen in the future. And Brian chimes in with, but we are feeding off them. We're feeding off the comics, feeding off the novels because they're part of the universe. So that is a pretty strong commitment. Again, they open themselves up to the idea we may retcon if required, but that is true of almost any Avatar content that comes out. There are retcons here and there, even within the shows themselves. We've had retcons for other material kind of recently. Them saying that the comics are basically not just kind of locked in forever, we will never make any adjustments at all ever. That's just kind of normal for any fictional universe that kind of goes on this long. And certainly the takeaway from this is absolutely not that they're retconning all of the early comics. They're basically saying there might be some small tweaks that they might have to make, but at the same time, as we'll kind of go through, we're kind of talking about, like, well, what are they talking about there? Like, what could that possibly mean? And a movie that's set maybe 10 years after a lot of the comics, how are we going to even notice something like that it's a retcon of a comic? But the main point, like I said, is just, hey, this is hugely positive for the comics. Tim Hedrick basically teasing comic characters, and the creators directly being like, yeah, we view those comics, we're feeding off them. It's all canon. So let's get into going through some things that are maybe the most likely to kind of show up as clear comic references. Now, ultimately, a lot of this stuff, as we'll go through here, is going to be basically characters, but there will be a few other little bits and pieces that we kind of talk about here. So yeah, stuff from the comics, the movie, and future Avatar content from Avatar Studios may have to reference and or explain, because if they covered the right things in the movie, it's kind of hard to avoid introducing some of these characters. And so questions are immediately going to come up from people who maybe haven't read the comics. When did this happen? And it's going to be fascinating to see if they explain it, or do they just leave it there with the idea that, oh, read the comics, and how they go about doing that. So, number one, the really obvious one, Ursa is back. Zuko's mom is back in the story. She is in fact alive, and as of the Search comic, she has been found, and she's fully kind of reincorporated back into Zuko's life. And there's a whole lot more to this, as we'll get into with some of the other points on the list, but just the big detail of Ursa's back. That teaser from the end of ATLA, Where Is My Mother? That's giant cliffhanger about this. We have the full resolution to this, basically. A full comic covering Ursa's backstory, finding her and bringing her back into the fold, basically. This is a hugely notable thing because you've already done a bit of a teaser reference to this in Korra, the first episode of Korra, of course. 13th anniversary today, of course. Very exciting. But Jinora, of course, talks to Katara and is like, what happened to Zuko's mom? Little did we know, or I guess we maybe did know at the time, the next comic, the second comic coming out a few months later, was going to be the Search about answering this very question. But the idea here is, of course, that if we cover Zuko and we get to see his family in the Fire Nation, well, it would make sense that we maybe see Ursa in the background of some of these scenes, especially because there's more to it than just Ursa. So people are going to be asking what happened, and specifically with this one, because the Search is quite an in-depth story. It's not just, oh, we randomly found her one day. There's a whole story to this about Ursa as a character. Do we attempt to explain this to people in some sort of a recap thing, or do we just leave it there? She's back, and people then ask the question, is there a story I missed? You hope that they come across the comic, and that's the kind of connections that you're going for. It's an interesting one. But we will move on while also still acknowledging that. The two is directly related to this, but Ki and Norin exist. So, again, these are comic exclusive characters that will need some sort of an explanation, but also are characters who make sense to, if you cover Zuko's family, you have to cover these characters as well. Because, hey, did you know that Zuko has another sister? Azula and Zuko have a sister, Ki. And that there's a new kind of father figure in their life because Ursa kind of has remarried. She married her old kind of love from the past, the person she had to leave because of the forced arranged marriage with Ozai. She's back together with Norin, and they had Ki together. That's crazy. So Ki, I think, when you refer to like Tim Hedrick here, I think Ki is probably the character that maybe is actually being referred to there, because by the time we get to, say, the movie, we're going to be, like I said, between 8 to 12 years on. Ki's going to be like somewhere in the region of like 14 to maybe 18, give or take, and she's going to be right at the perfect age where like she's going to stand out a little bit more as a character. And that's going to prompt a lot of questions depending on, how much focus they do or don't give her. But either way, the idea here is that you have this new family unit in the Fire Nation that people in the comics are very familiar with at this point. Non-comic readers won't be familiar. That, hey, here's Zuko, and we're maybe expecting Zuko and May to maybe be together, but then here is Zuko's side of the family where Ursa's back, and like here's Ki, and here's Norin, and we'll get to Azula in just a second. But this is a very notable thing that they are going to have to kind of delve into. And, Ki has just kind of come back into the story after kind of quite a while not appearing in any comics in Ashes of the Academy. So they're fully committing to, this is the way they're going with it. It's just, will they or won't they have a reference to this? Now, of course, the thing we have to factor in here with that, say, that first movie, it's probably not going to be massively focused on, say, Zuko's family. But if it ends up being the case that, say, it's 3 Avatar movies that are all roughly sequels to each other, movie 2 or movie 3 could be a more Fire Nation focused movie, allowing Ki, Ursa, Norin, Azula, as we'll get to have a little bit more of a spotlight. So that's going to be so interesting to see. They're definitely among the most notable characters that we need to address. Azula, of course, is just one of these characters where less a reference and more one of these projects, I think, has the capacity to tell a hugely notable story by telling the story of Azula's arc post-series. So yeah, number 3, Azula's arc is open and active. So as of kind of the last time we really saw her, she is out on her own. She's trying to find new followers, a new place to rule. She keeps basically gathering groups of people together, causing a bit of chaos, but it kind of falling apart. The people that she has gained the trust of out of kind of fear, kind of, realize they care about other things more than that. They abandon her and she just moves on. And we're waiting for, when is the kind of penny going to drop for Azula? When is she actually going to make her big development move? Because Azula's out there and open. Then you have the family, which is kind of more or less in a much more stable situation now, as much as it's changed. The only thing missing from this family dynamic is that Azula, as far as we're aware, is not part of it yet. So we want to see Azula have some sort of an arc where she eventually has a conversation with her mother, addresses some of the issues at play here, and we see where they want to take Azula as a character, because we have no clue where her arc goes. We didn't see Azula at all in Korra, and the comics have more or less left her off here, relatively open, with the idea that I guess she's going to repeat the same cycle a few times before maybe something significant happens. So, is one of the movies the place for that arc to kind of play out? Or are we going to do it all in the comics and then it can allow the movie to kind of use Azula as needed? So there's that big kind of question of, when we see Azula next, will we just sort of know the end of her arc because the movie reveals something about her? Or is the movie where that arc is actually going to fully play out? Those are the kind of big and massive questions, because here is something where you can absolutely do a full big project related to this. And you don't, I think, have to go crazy with referencing all the previous comics with Azula, because just, I think, by exploring where she is at presently, in terms of like new stuff going forward, you're going to hit on a lot of the topics that have been already covered with Azula, and you can do subtle references to a lot of this other stuff, like the search and stuff like that, and like we want to see what Azula's dynamic is like with her sister and stuff like that. So there is that. Next, another character, but on the one of the other family side of things for the main characters, Hakoda is in a relationship with Melina, this woman from the Northern Water Tribe. So this is all from North and South, of course. It's a pretty serious relationship that is a significant part of that book. And while I don't think they directly confirm they're going to get married, I assume the assumption probably would be in a few years' time, probably Hakoda does get remarried, and Melina is the likely kind of option there. So it makes sense that if we do ever have a situation where we really focus in on the Southern Water Tribe, and we kind of maybe like Zuko, maybe seeing his family, we get to see Katara and Sokka's family, that Melina would be a character who makes sense to be there in the background somewhere, because they used her so heavily here. Again, that one is a little bit more like, you maybe have to go a little bit deeper into the Southern stuff to make this reference happen, but it's there. It's a character of note who, it's like, yeah, like this would kind of surprise people a little bit to see this. So that's interesting. Another thing, just on the shipping side of things, but in the first main comic trilogy, The Promise, Mai and Zuko broke up, and technically they're still not back together. Now, obviously, a lot of development has happened with both characters to get them to a point where they are so much more developed, they have a much better relationship now, they just haven't reunited officially in that regard. But I think most people who are paying attention to this stuff fully realize that Azumi's mother is highly likely to be Mai, that this is the canon ship. So the question really here is about, are they going to remain broken up the next time we see them, or are they going to be back together? This could explain a little bit and kind of set the stage for maybe what the comics are doing, because if the movie just goes in and the two of them are together, which is probably likely, that means that them getting back together is something that the comics will have to do at some point, just to establish when exactly that happened. I do think after Ashes of the Academy, it's only a matter of time, because they're both in a good position right now. But again, because we maybe expect to see the likes of Ki in the background, Ursa in the background, we would also expect to see, Mai as well, Fire Lady Mai, hopefully. Because depending on where we're at, we're getting to the point where it's going to be actually very close to the birth, or a lot of the kid characters being born. So they're going to have these two kind of roughly be in that position. So again, it's like, do they reference the fact that they were broken up, or do we just jump into the movie and they're back together? Either way, comic fans have a little bit more insight into kind of their relationship and what exactly has happened. It's just that maybe non-comic readers would be just unaware of one specific breakup that did happen, and that continuity is kind of still there. Next, we'll get into two different groups of characters, which I think, again, are somewhat likely to probably make some sort of an appearance. So at number 6, I have Toph's metal bending students. So specifically the main three, the first three. The Dark One, Penga, and Ho-Tun. So this is the Dark One, this is Ho-Tun, and this is Penga. These were the first three characters that Toph discovered had the potential to be metal benders beyond herself. Her first three students that she trained, and after some struggles, they were actually able to metal bend, and are now, after multiple comics, skilled enough that they are basically kind of teachers themselves at Toph's metal bending academy. They're more or less at the level of kind of master, or at least as close as you can get to being a metal bender master, given that there's only a handful of them in the world. But still, these are hugely important characters, because Metal Bender 2, 3, and 4 that's big. And given that there is some stuff that needs to kind of happen stemming off from metal bending with regards to, like, we don't really know a lot about, say, the status of the metal bending academy going into the Korra era. Does she leave it in the control maybe of her 3 students here? What exactly forms the Republic City Police Force and brings metal benders into play? There's a lot of things like that where these characters would make sense to be involved to a certain degree. Like if we are doing a reintroduction to Toph, where Team Avatar have to go pick her up basically for a mission or something like that, it would make sense that we go to the academy, and so we get to see these 3 leading classes there. And Toph leaves and is like, hey, you guys are in charge. And it'll be very fun to see these characters years into the future, because they did start off as very one-note characters in their first appearances, but have become a lot more reliable even as of like their second and third appearances in the comics. So they're kind of just unique as a group there, and again, it makes sense that they could appear at some point. On the Aang side of things, we know a bunch of the original Air acolytes, because the movie, the title is going to have, again, The Last Airbender in it. We're going to have to acknowledge, like, years on, what is Aang's approach with kind of keeping the airbender culture alive, the air nomad culture alive. We know about the Air acolytes. Well, we got some of the origin story for the Air acolytes we see in Korra in the comics, including basically meeting a lot of the characters who become the first Air acolytes. So the main trio that we have are these 3 characters here. So we have Yi Li here, we have Jingbo here, and Jing Ying here. Now, a lot of these characters initially started out as these members of these specific Aang fan clubs in different kind of Earth Kingdom cities, but once he kind of met up with them, he started to actually give them proper Air Nomad teachings, having, them previously just been broadly interested in them, but not having too much of a direction. This is why you'll note that Jing Ying here is kind of quite notable. She has the headband over arrow tattoos. She's not an airbender, to be clear. She just, as part of her own kind of, like, in a way, research into air nomad culture, realized the arrow tattoos were a thing, and in her mind, out of respect, she put them on herself. But when Aang met her, he kind of highlighted that, these are tattoos that have to be earned. So he was a little bit annoyed about it, but he could see that she was just honestly interested in the culture. So she continues on as an Air acolyte, but she covers up the tattoos, which is an interesting one in terms of that's going to be a really identifiable character if we maybe go to Air Temple Island, which has been set up from Imbalance and stuff like that. She should be very easily spottable as someone who would have a partial Air Nomad tattoo on her head, or she wears a headband. And again, these are kind of fun characters, and you want to see what that progress is. What is the situation with the Air Temples a few kind of years on into the future, especially Air Temple Island early on. So these 2 are cool just in terms of however they go about doing the reintroduction to Toph and Aang, but then also, like I've already highlighted, like Zuko, like the reintroduction to him and a lot of the characters who are connected to him. What did they do there? With Katara and Sokka, of course, Melina is one of those kind of interlinked characters as well. And we're going to see that, like, the South is a bit more interconnected with the rest of the world because of, like, the events of North and South. But we move on, going into Toph a little bit more on the family side of things. So Toph has a relationship again with her father as of the comic The Rift. So Lao is back in play. But we learned in The Rift that Poppy left Lao kind of shortly afterwards, after the kind of chaos happened, basically. And we know in the future that Poppy and Lao will get back together. So again, if we're getting introduced to the key elements for Toph, maybe her father is around, maybe we actually see that Poppy is back in play. That would confirm to us that, I guess, there probably is a story in the comics they maybe should tell about when Poppy comes back into play. Because we've not seen that happen in the comics, but we know it does happen. So again, a bit of an unanswered plot point from ATLA. Again, remember Toph sent the letter back to her family. Katara helped her. But we never got any sort of real resolution about that within the show itself. But at least Toph has met her father again, and they have a better relationship. It's quite business focused to a certain degree, but they are on better terms. He doesn't view her as being helpless or anything like that anymore, and that's why The Rift is, I think, such a pretty strong comic. Moving on. Cabbage Merchant, of course. I think we all expect some sort of a Cabbage Merchant reference to happen in the movie in some way. Like, it just feels like you kind of have to almost in some way. But they actually have a way to do it and make it a little bit more of a notable reference and not just the meme character being used again. Because we know the Cabbage Merchant goes on to form Cabbage Corp, one of the main kind of businesses in Republic City. So where does that interest come from? Well, we get the origin of this in the Rift comic, though this is as far as it's gone. He sees the newly built forklift that Satoru has invented fly past him, and he notes that this is a remarkable machine. So this is where the spark of like, oh, maybe technology is what I should latch on into the future. Look how things are advancing. At some point, he's obviously going to invest in, forming a company here. And it would be cool to see little Lao Gan Lan, who we of course meet in Korra, and maybe get to see early Cabbage Corp and what they're about, and maybe have the actual Cabbage Merchant say, "Not my Cabbage Corp," whereas previously his son has been the only one who's said that. So there's actually the room for a nice reference to kind of continuity as well as the meme character of the Cabbage Merchant, which is kind of interesting. And then I'll just end on this one of like Mei, another kind of Fire Nation significant kind of character related to family. Mei's father Ukano is in prison after the events of Smoke and Shadow. So he basically, over the course of that comic, led a little bit of a coup against Zuko with the new Ozai Society. He wanted Ozai back in power and went against Zuko. He actually joined up with Azula. They kidnapped kids, including Ki and Tom Tom. So those two characters have a little bit of a kind of connection. But also, like, Tom Tom is an interesting example of, like, in 10 years' time, he's going to be more than just the little brother kind of character who doesn't have much character. He's going to stand out a little bit more. He's going to have a character of his own if we ever get introduced to him properly. But yeah, Ukano is in prison after the end of this book. So what's the situation? Do we see him, he just got out at some point, or is he still in prison? And this is where, like, if we get introduced to Mei's family, which ones are there? Like, is Michi there, her mother? If it is Ukano not there? Those are the questions, of course, we would have. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other characters in the series as well, that in the comics that we could maybe get introduced to, like, say, Sun from Toph Beifong's Metal Bending Academy, the lava bender who Toph is going to try to help master his abilities. That's sort of interesting. Might we see Jang, the kind of pirate character who Katara met before? That could be an option. If we ever got introduced to the Freedom Fighters again, Sneers has a girlfriend in Kori who's quite important when it comes to Yu Dao, a city that's kind of notable when it comes to like the formation of Republic City and kind of what we're doing here. Because again, I'd also note when it comes to say stuff like this and also stuff with Lao, they are important characters in terms of kind of setting up shop and businesses in Cranefish Town. And Cranefish Town is ultimately the centerpiece of like what will become Republic City. Cranefish literally will become Republic City in the future. That sort of idea, at least part of it. So, that sort of setup stuff is all there. Now, I don't have Republic City down on the list because I think it's so obvious that is something they're going to subtly talk about in the background. But that's not really a comic reference. That's just bridging the gap to Korra as such, which we've already kind of done with the likes of Imbalance and some of the setup stuff from like The Promise and The Rift. So it's going to be kind of fascinating. Like, there will be comic references just because some of the Avatar comics are such significant stories. How can we not? But this just highlights that there are absolutely characters from the comics who will just, by virtue of appearing in any way in the new stuff, will have people who've not read the comics going, huh? When did that happen? And again, will they attempt to explain or recap any of this stuff within the body of the new content? Or are they just going to leave this there as, hey, ask the question online and I'm sure the fandom will direct you towards the right comic? Because obviously Tim Hedrick is saying, like, hey, if you're waiting for the new stuff, read the comics because you'll be caught up to speed. It'll be fascinating to see how it all kind of comes together, how many references there are. And I do want to be clear on that coming to the end here. It's just that I don't think they're going to go comic reference crazy. Like I said, I don't think, say, like the first movie is going to have a reference to every single one of these characters. But a couple, perhaps, because it makes sense. Because so much stuff has happened with the characters and their families and people close to them. Different groups like Toph's metal bending students and the Air Acolytes for Aang. If you are in the right location with the right characters, it only makes sense that some of these characters should be with them. And that's the kind of point I'm making here. Sure, maybe the Zuko stuff with Ursa, Ki, Nora, and Azula, maybe that's a bit too much for maybe movie 1. Maybe we'll keep the Zuko background interaction to maybe just Zuko and Mai. And then maybe movie 2 we get more Fire Nation focused and Azula becomes a pretty big plot point. And we can do something there. Those type of ideas and topics. So, wrapping up the video there, opening up the comment section immediately. What references, what things from the comics do you think we will see pretty directly referenced in Avatar Studios content? What characters or details are going to happen? Which ones might they need to explain? How do you think they'll approach actually doing some of these references when they do them? Like, will they explain the Ursa backstory? Or just have her be there and have fans ask the question? Those are the big questions for me. Let me know in the comments below, but otherwise that's been the video. Thanks for watching and bye.